Thank you for having me here tonight. What I like to do is introduce myself in my own language. It's called Skaruda Geha. It was a language that evolved and was developed here along the Appalachian Range and into the lower Great Lakes, all the way down to North Carolina. It's one of the most endangered languages, so you folks working on rare, threatened, and endangered species, thinking about how little we have left in terms of diversity, you might appreciate hearing this maybe for the first time in your life. So it's something my mother taught me to do. And so I always begin by saying, Twan Oskanaha, Gatha Degwadia, Disna Wachnana, Skarura, Equahewat Gayadakra, Igisa Seta Diretox, Disna Wakutna, Afnawenta Udaya, Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Awagana Harata, Disna Yakwachanati Ha Eque, Galahewa, Disna Yakwate Ruchne, Ha Yakwatetne, Dijunawetne. This is a very short introduction in the Tuscarora language. Had we had the time today, I would have shared a long opening address for maybe an hour or more, really bringing our minds together as one. We say, Una Jakwadigera, Udigera is our mind. And it's the idea that before we meet together as human beings, we have to recognize all of the natural world that has brought us here together today, that everything we need in life was put here on Turtle Island. And so we remind ourselves that in a process we call the Thanksgiving Address. Some of you may have read about this in Dr. Kimmerer's work, who was our founding director at the center, where we really focus on thinking about both scientific ecological knowledge, but also something that has come out in the recent decades called traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples. And we do this mainly through our focus on research, outreach, and education. And we want to share a little bit today about how this research and education and outreach has been part of healing, part of our mission to heal ourselves and to heal our relationship with settlers who now live on the same river that we live on. One of the pathways for healing, there are many different pathways. In my community, people are sitting down every day and trying to become fluent in our language. There are folks who are returning to ceremonial practice and understanding ceremonial speeches and songs and dances. And the one thing that we tend to focus on at the center is something that is often called biocultural restoration. So we often think about degraded sites like brownfields or some of these islands that were being mentioned as a place that is in real need of biophysical restoration, right? But for Indigenous people, that is inextricably linked with cultural restoration. When we heal the land, we can also heal ourselves. And that's the kind of the theme that we want to share a little bit today in some of the work going on in that realm. This is a picture of a spear fisherman from my community with a lake sturgeon. It was a very common practice for our people to harvest sturgeon in the Niagara River. And I'm proud to say 2 years ago, some folks, including my son Aguajo and some others from around the Confederacy, went down to the Niagara River and actually did bring home a sturgeon that we speared for the first time in over 50 years. And for us, this was a really important moment, a sort of a watershed moment to see the return of this practice after a long period of contamination, right, of fish, of extirpation of these species, being able to bring those relatives back home in this practice of spearfishing. This kind of cultural revitalization mixed with ecological restoration Comes to mind what Vine Deloria said, one of our most famous indigenous authors in North America over the last century or so. He says, traditional ecological knowledge is like the intellectual twin to scientific ecological knowledge. And our job has not been to integrate or even necessarily to braid, but to figure out how they cooperate for the continuation of life. The symbol you see here is actually near and dear to this land, and it's made from mollusks that live right here off of the Long Island Sound and off of the Atlantic coast, that Haudenosaunee people had an extensive trade network to produce these beads that we wove into mats. Today they're called wampum belts, and the symbol you see here is something we call Gayartestiyu, and that is the Great Law of Peace. It is the binding constitution of 5 nations. Anybody know the 5 nations? Or at least let's say one.
It's Seneca?
Seneca, absolutely. So Seneca's, yep, and Oneida's on the other. Onondaga, not Iroquois. Mohawk. You're forgetting one nation who is federally recognized that has no land, and that's Cayuga. Yep. And of course, Onondaga being the central firekeeper, where the Tree of Peace was planted. This is our Constitution, and some folks have actually credited the Haudenosaunee people with inspiring the U.S. Constitution, the Confederation of 13 separate colonies under this binding law. But the problem is they forgot the role of women in this process. And so in our way, I am what my mother is. So my social and political identity is with the Bears. I don't consider my last name as being important to who I am. I don't consider my first name. Those are my taxpayer names, right? I have a totally separate identity where I come from in my community. And in my community, I've been super fortunate to have grown up around leaders who did a lot of international work talking about why this revitalization is so important to who we are. These folks traveled to the United Nations in 1976. It was a really important moment where our chiefs and our clan mothers sat alongside other world leaders and actually brought up issues of climate change, actually brought up issues of colonization and the colonial experiment that's taking place right now as we speak. They said, we are in grave danger of losing who we are. And when we lose who we are, we also see that degrading in the natural world. So I have 2 uncles here, Stuart and Leo, who traveled with these folks. And their message was not about a technological solution. These folks did not talk about photovoltaics or Priuses or geothermal systems as the answer to this existential crisis. What they said was, we have a worldview that allows us to consider all of these things in the Thanksgiving address as our relatives. And that in fact, creation itself is the foundation for this Thanksgiving address. And so all of the different categories, the Mohawks call it Ohentagaliwadekwa. That's what you see written here in Ganyakahaga. It's often known as the words that come before all else. And I just love this sentence because I don't think there's ever been a time in Haudenosaunee written history that we see a clear definition of our mandate written down in very simple terms. And that is, our duty is to support life in conjunction with the other beings. So every decision that we're making is we're keeping that central to who we are. Now, of course, we're human beings like other people. We have issues of greed, power, boundaries, languages, all kinds of impediments to supporting life in conjunction with those other beings. And one of the things that had to happen for the Confederation to work was an agreement about the natural world. And this is called our One Dish Wampum Agreement. It says that all of the natural world is contained in this single purple circle, and that it is our job to protect that dish, to keep it clean, and never allow a knife or a fork to enter that dish. This is also not only a natural resource policy about the prohibition of private lands, the idea that no one owns land or water. It's also about sustainability. And what they said was that all of the natural world is like represented by a beaver tail. And that beaver tail is in that dish. And it's our job to pass that beaver tail around this room and make sure there's equity, not equality. We don't slice up the beaver tail in equal portions. We pass it around. And this is the reason why we don't vote. When I was a real young kid, my mom told me, she said, "Neil, don't you ever vote. That's like putting a knife and a fork into this dish." And I do a fun exercise in my class. And I say, let's vote on having a final exam, students. And you can see the tension that is immediate when people are forced to divide up that dish into equal parts. Our language that we use to describe this process, these political ideologies or these political wills, is not English. So everything I'm saying today, except for my short introduction, is a gloss. It's very difficult for me to talk about Gaia Restiu without breaking those words down. And I just want to share real quick, before I turn it over to Catherine, an insight into why language matters. Because I think the Linnaean Society, I'm guessing, has an admiration for the way Carl Linnaeus described the world, right? For the Latin that's used for the species that you're all interested in when you're on your bird tours. We have a different way of naming the natural world. It's often called ethnotaxonomy. And for Haudenosaunee people, it's so fascinating because it is a verb-based language. And so our names for birds and for animals and for rivers and for mountains are essentially a poem. They can contain several nouns, but they always contain one verb. And the reason that's important is because it's describing relationships often between the speaker and the agent, often between the pronoun. For our pronominal prefixes, we have 52 pronouns in Haudenosaunee language that we all use simultaneously. How many pronouns are there in English? About. There's about a dozen if you include possessive pronouns, right? Or plural pronouns. There's a pronoun in Haudenosaunee language just for a really elderly group of older women. And that's it. And we only use that pronoun to describe the relationships that the verbs and the nouns have in that concept. And I want to share just one quick example. It's not a bird. I haven't got to birds yet, mainly because Catherine and I are always thinking about plants. But this is a plant you're bound to see in Central Park. It's got a really odd name that goes back to biblical times. Does anybody know this? Solomon seal, that's right. So I always thought, who is Solomon growing up? Like, what does that mean to me? What does Solomon's seal have to do with this plant? I only knew this plant as Skitnoxawahyuks. That's how you say it in Tuscarora, Skitnoxawahyuks. And I kind of knew, like I was forced to memorize, like through rote memorization, some of these plant names. I didn't really understand the pronouns and how they worked and the verbiage until I started really studying the language. And I was able to do this really extensive translation of all of our pronouns, our prefixes, our nouns, our verbs, to tell the story of this plant and to really describe it as something in our language that describes a relationship between a plant and an animal that Western science has yet to do, right? So I went to college at ESF, and I thought, surely there must be a study about the red fox and Solomon seal, and there are none, right? But Skarudet people were encoding this for thousands of years in their language, describing not only the relationship between these berries and this fox, but even within fox. And when I ask elders and I think, why did they call fox, its skin is bad? It's interesting because mange was not a thing in this country, right? It was introduced into the canid population like over 100 years ago. So it must be that Tuscarora people were noticing this red fox having these high rates of mange. They gave that red fox this name. Again, its skin is bad, right? So even within the name Skitnoxa, you can think about relationships, just go beyond plants and people. This language that I've shared with you tonight, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquoian Linguistic Association, it includes Cherokee, it includes Nottoway, Meherrin, Susquehannock, languages that are actually extinct and no longer spoken. They're so important because they help us guide our land ethic. And I borrowed this slide from Rick Hill, who's been working on trying to define how do we take care of place? What does biocultural restoration look like? And every single time the answer is the one thing you don't want to do is put decisions about land in the hands of men. Women have to make those decisions about land. And in my family, I don't own land. We have hundreds of acres in my family, but it's only my sisters that are going to end up with that land. Men don't make decisions about land. It just does not make sense when you think about creation, when you think about the ability of women to nurture and to provide life. That is their role in our society. I don't have time to get into the Turo Wampum, but that is how I relate to settlers in this place, right? So just geographically thinking about where this takes place, this is Haudenosaunee territory previous to the colonization, right? Previous to colonies claiming spaces, the dominion of set down through the church and the state. And so it's quite a large area. My ancestors come from that darker red down there in the Carolinian Piedmont. We came north after the Confederation happened about 2,000 years ago. And all of this land, one of the things that's true and that we're thinking about in our restoration projects is the cultural motifs of Haudenosaunee people that guide our care. And our care is really rooted in thinking about edge spaces. And I know you all probably as birders appreciate edges quite a bit. This is a very firm belief in Haudenosaunee way of thinking that there is a forest and there is a clearing, right? And that the clearing is the space for agriculture, it's the space for production, it's the space of women to make decisions about who enters that space and who leaves that space. And we actually have a ceremony called the Edge of the Woods that I probably would have also offered to this group had we had more time. And that is focused on addressing the grief that we all are carrying when we walk into these open spaces. Finally, I just want to share a little bit more in detail in terms of how these ecological zones provide for people and the kind of healing that we're after. It is something folks have called the seasonal rounds. I've heard it called traditional lifeways. And in our way of thinking, we move in a counterclockwise direction. So right now, we're just moving out of the most beautiful season that our ancestors have seen for centuries, millennia, where these amazing trees provide sugar to us every single year. And so for Haudenosaunee ceremony, it's not about hope. It's not about faith or asking for more sap from the maple tree. It is only about giving thanks that these cycles continue every single year. And so we'll do that with the wild strawberry. That will be coming up. Soon you all will be seeing those little berries, the first berry to emerge on our berry plants. These ceremonies, of course, are done in our language. They're done with our traditional knowledge holders who know the words and the practices and the species that are needed for this to happen. And admittedly, as I began to talk about Skarudat Gethap, these systems are at risk, right? Most dramatically around language and the loss of language. Some of our other practices around agriculture and hunting have remained strong. But as I also began the story around sturgeon, you know, contaminants play a big role in these slopes you see here on the graph. Loss of access, loss of the ability to care for place, drive these slopes on this graph. But not all is in dire. I want to invite Catherine up now to share a little bit about how we're addressing this in terms of the healing. We're addressing this through a bunch of different projects. We're going to focus on the top two here. But if you're interested in others, you know, we just completed an agreement with the Nature Conservancy, who bought 600 acres of land in the Adirondack Park for our Native youth programming. We are continuing to document the loss of culturally significant plants in our communities and to think about restoration. Where do those plants need our help? So I want to ask Catherine to come up and share a little bit about Onondaga and Tonawanda. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil. I've heard Neil speak so many times, and I think I'm inspired every time. That was great. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us. I'm a birder. Used to bird a lot more, but trying to get into it again. So it's great to be around bird people and hear about your birdathon and everything else going on. So, as Neil said, I'm going to talk about two examples of healing that we at the center are involved in, and that in particular I'm working on. So the first one is related to this land that was returned to the Onondaga Nation as part of the Onondaga Lake settlement. Has anyone heard of Onondaga Lake? A few people, okay. Yeah, so this was considered at one point one of the most polluted lakes in the country. It was a major Superfund site with a number of subsites. And as part of the cleanup process, the polluter, which in this case was Honeywell or Allied Chemical, has to compensate the public for damages due to contamination. So one of the ways they do that is to return land. And they were giving land to these various organizations. And at that, there was a point where the Onondaga Nation, whose sacred lake this is, as someone pointed out, was getting nothing. But the center had a role in changing that, and in other words, this wasn't easy to make this happen. But eventually the nation did get 1,000 acres as part of the settlement, and it's really beautiful land. There's waterfalls like this beautiful one here, Fellows Falls. There's some mature forest. There's wetlands, there's ag lands, I'm going to talk more about. Just to show you where it is, it's within the historic lands and unceded lands of the Onondaga Nation, which is kind of a slice right through the center part of the state. Looking at current political boundaries, this is Onondaga County, Syracuse, and this doesn't show the current territory of the Onondaga Nation, but that's just south of Syracuse, and that's where the land is, and it's in these two parcels here. So just to show you a little bit about the topography, it's in these glaciated areas. So you're looking at a glacial U-shaped valley. So here's the south parcel, north parcel, and you can see we have floodplain, quite a bit of land on the floodplain, as well as some on these slopes, which can be quite steep. That's where that waterfalls is that I just showed you. Other glacial features are this Valley Heads moraine, which is actually the watershed divide between the Great Lakes to the north and the Susquehanna to the south. And so water flows north here into Onondaga Lake and Lake Ontario. So this is all Onondaga Lake watershed. So of course, originally this was indigenous land, and if you talk to people from the Onondaga Nation, they say the land wasn't returned, we never gave it up. So it definitely considered it unceded. So people have been around, we think, for about 13,000 years since the last glaciation. There's evidence of indigenous presence. People would have come north to hunt caribou and such pretty early on. Fast forward to, say, the past 1,000 years, or actually about the past 6,000 years, the main vegetation would be closed canopy forest. Anyone who says there were large areas of grassland in central New York, that's crazy. As well as things like cedar swamps on the bottom in the floodplain. And I want to share with you a quotation from John Bartram, who some of you may have heard of. Anybody heard of? Yeah, an early naturalist who visited Onondaga in 1743. We're not sure exactly where he was, but it probably fairly close to this 1,000 acres. And he's describing it as very rich and full of tall timber quite to the top of the ridge. The trees were linden, basswood, elm, sugar maple, white walnut would be butternut probably, oak, hickory, and chestnut. And then ginseng and most sorts of herbs that grow on our rich limestone land. So a couple things to note here is there was American elm. Of course, this was long before Dutch elm disease. This was before butternut canker, of course, chestnut blight. So we've lost a number of these trees, we haven't entirely lost them, but certainly as major forest components. We've also lost a lot of these forest floor herbs, and if you talk to people from Onondaga, they call them medicines. A lot of these plants like the Solomon seal, trillium, wild ginger, these have medicinal value. And so one of the things the center is working on is a project to restore these understory plants, which mainly because of deer herbivory, and there's other causes, there's fewer and fewer of them in our forests, as many of you probably are aware. So the 1,000 acres site has various historic or settler land use legacies, including from agriculture, things like deforestation, impacts of livestock introduction, predator control. You know, there used to be wolves and mountain lions, bear, bobcat in the, what is now the Syracuse area. And of course, a lot of those animals were intentionally extirpated because of conflicts with livestock, et cetera. Another land use legacy, which is unique to this Tully Valley, is solution brine mining. And this goes back to Onondaga Lake. There was, in the late 1800s, this company that set up to manufacture soda ash along the shores of Onondaga Lake. And they took advantage of two materials that the Syracuse area had in abundance, and that was limestone and salt. Maybe some of you have heard of Syracuse called the Salt City. So salt was used as an industrial ingredient. The brine springs immediately around the lake were not of sufficient concentration. So they moved south and actually found the halite bed. It was like 1,000 feet below ground, but they set up these wells in order to inject water, dissolve the halite, and then pipe the brine back via gravity feed to the shores of Onondaga Lake. So at one point, there were like 120 of these wells in the Tully Valley where the 1,000 acres is. And one of the issues with this kind of mining over 100 years is that you dissolve that layer of salt, which is about 100 feet thick, leaving this cavity. And so guess what? You start getting things like fractures and sinkholes and subsidence. So that too is part of the land use legacy. And you can see that this kind of landscape industrialization extends to lack of vegetation, road building, that kind of thing as well. So the Onondaga Nation compiled a vision statement for the 1,000 acres in 2022. And the main word that they used, the word we're using in our presentation, was healing. They want to see healing of the land, healing of the ties between people and land. And so our role, we assisted with a land transfer. As I said, it was not an easy thing. The state originally wanted to keep it for a WMA. We also provide technical support for, say, restoration planning, restoration implementation. We also have lots of graduate students at ESF. So this young lady here, who actually teaches now at a school in the Bronx. This is Jade Morning Sky Little. She was our first master's student who did a project on the 1,000 acres. And she's here with community members that she would take out to be with her when she collected her plant data. So research, we've done brook trout research, we did a wetland study. Like I said, we're working on the understory plant work. Also labor for things like invasive species removal, as well as funding for these projects. So I wanted to just give you an example. You were looking at the south partial here, and each of those little green polygons is an agricultural field. The Onondaga Nation did not develop these fields. These were legacy from the previous owner, and many of these were intensively monocropped. And the nation said to the farmers who had leased the lands in the past, you can continue to farm here, but you can't use pesticides. And that kind of put an end to a lot of farming. So as a result, there are many abandoned ag fields. So one of our projects has been to select one of these fields. It happens to be the one labeled, not very creatively, S3C there, and to return that first to a pollinator meadow, and then later, in the long run, we'd like that to return to floodplain forest. So the first step was to not just put the plants in, but restore the site physical features, and you just notice the contrast between this cornfield, which probably been corn for decades, and then the complexity here of the Onondaga Creek floodplain, these former abandoned channels, oxbows, et cetera. So we worked with biologists from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and our partners there designed these little, we call them worms or spaghetti because he happens to be Italian. But basically, we literally dug out these floodplain features to kind of mimic and kind of try to restore some of that complexity of the alluvial floodplains. You can see already here, a snapping turtle has laid eggs here, so they're coming back already. And then we planted it, like I said, to about 40 meadow species. And I like this photo because it shows the partners. So we work a lot with partnerships. So Jan, on the end here, is from Fish and Wildlife, Cody from the Onondaga Nation, there's Neil, and then Lauren is a graduate student at ESF doing a bat project at Tonawanda, which I'll talk about shortly. We chose to, Yeah, we chose to hand seed. We could have had a tractor seed this all, but we wanted to make this an event, like a community event, and involve people in actively restoring the site. So we made it, we had food, we kind of made it a fun day, and did it most of it by hand, although we had to do some with the tractor. So that was just a quick example of one project that we're doing with the Onondaga Nation on the 1,000 acres. The next thing I want to talk about, and this has some relevance to birds, is work we're doing with the Haudenosaunee Nation and this stamp site. So does anyone know where the Haudenosaunee Nation is? It's in the western part of the state, kind of between Rochester and Buffalo. Has anyone been to Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge? Okay, yeah, since you're birders, I thought maybe you'd been up there. But the nation's here. The stamp site is here, right next to the nation, which is a major issue, major environmental justice issue right there. But notice also these protected lands to the north. This is all part of a giant wetland, forest, grassland complex, sometimes called the Alabama Swamp. And it's one of the largest areas of contiguous habitat left in the western part of the state. So there's some real issues with siting an industrial park here, not only right next to the nation, but also kind of in the middle of these natural areas. A little bit more about it. STAMP stands for Science and Technology Advanced Manufacturing Park. The developer is the Genesee County Economic Development Center. It's a little over 1,200 acres. They've been having trouble getting tenants. They're looking for advanced manufacturing. Tenants have not had much luck. There's been a lot of controversy about this site, so maybe that has something to do with it. The current plans are to develop it with what else? A massive data center. This thing is huge, 40 football fields, uses massive amounts of water and electricity, and there are major tax subsidies that have been requested. Right now, there are public hearings. I believe there's a comment period that's still open till April 15th. I encourage anybody who's interested to submit a comment. I brought some literature about this project that would help. So what is our role? You know, we're not an advocacy organization. I mean, I can go as a private citizen and attend one of these hearings. I can write letters, and I certainly do. But one of the things we do at the center is we were invited by the Haudenosaunee Nation to come in and to document the biological diversity on the nation. And why would we do that? Well, partly is to help build the case against stamp by finding rare, threatened, endangered species, but also just to show what a biodiverse area it is, and also to show the Haudenosaunee Nation as outstanding stewards of their land. And I can say I've been on the nation a number of times, and I can't give you a lot of information because we keep our data confidential, but the contrast between what I've seen on the nation and, say, the average state forest or the surrounding WMAs is just amazing. You know, in terms of insects, birds, rare plants, etc. We do have permission to talk about the birds that we've seen. So since you are birders, I didn't put any labels on these pictures because I think you'll probably know what they are. Anybody recognize the little bluebird in the left there? Yeah. We actually, in one day of birding, we found 10 pairs of cerulean warblers. And you probably know that they're dependent on older, more mature gallery forests. So to me, you know, this says something about the nation's care of their forests. You know, the rotation, they don't have those short rotations they have, say, on state forest land or even on some of the WMAs. And these are all listed in one way or another as protected in the state as well. So many pairs of cerulean warblers, and how about the one in the middle? Golden wing, yeah. We found that with a recorder. So we also use ARUs. Since it's a good 2-hour drive from Syracuse, we can't be there every morning out birding. So we found the golden wing, also red-shouldered hawk, and a few other species that are of conservation concern. And then everybody knows the one in the right, the short-eared owl, which is listed as endangered in the state. This was not found on the nation land. This was actually found right on the Stamp campus. And there was a hearing and a public comment period because they have to get a Part 182 permit from the DEC to take land from the endangered species. And there were 800 comments opposing the granting of this permit, and the state still gave them the permit. I think there are things going on at higher levels of state government. This is not only an issue, of course, for wildlife and birds, but it's an issue of environmental justice. This is a quotation from Chief Roger Hill of the Tonawanda Seneca Nation, who's pictured there. The nation opposes the destruction of habitat by stamp, which directly threatens our land and water where we hunt, fish, gather medicine. Noise, excavation, light, truck traffic will drive away wildlife, impacts our people. This is not just an environmental concern, but a matter of human rights for the nation. And I'm just going to stop by saying that this stamp site, which is over here in Western New York, is not alone. This is part of this semiconductor superhighway or state smart innovation corridor. Up in Syracuse, we have Micron that has its own issues, maybe not quite as egregious as the stamp site. And there's others throughout the state. So we consider these continuing threats to indigenous land and to the kind of healing that the nation and that the Onondaga Nation and other indigenous communities are calling for. And I'll turn it over to Neil to close.
Just wanted to add, you know, as Catherine said, we're not really an advocacy organization, but part of the healing has to come through education, right? You all folks probably are aware of the delicate balance between documenting what's there and trying to be an advocate on its behalf, right? And the momentum is gaining. We brought members from Tonawanda to campus last week to share with students about what they can do. We see other nations like the Eastern Band of Cherokee actually banning data centers from their territory, as well as now the state of Maine. So I just wanted to hopefully end on a more positive note, because the healing we're doing, right, is it's happening at the same time of these threats to our sovereignty, right? These threats to our future generations. So we're happy to take questions. I think we might have gone over a bit. But Nyawa, thank you for being here. This is a group of folks at Fellows Falls. But so happy to take questions and appreciate you listening. So the question just folks could hear online is, if I can paraphrase it, are there companies that promote this sort of traditional knowledge aspect, but do it more in an urban setting? Is it? I think so the question about imposing on humans in other settings reminds me a lot of the pharmaceutical companies who are often mining this kind of knowledge from indigenous folks and commodifying it, right? And we saw that actually at Tonawanda with a company, they wanted to create what they called a green fuel, hydrogen fuel. So the company was called Plug Power. And I started talking about it with some older folks who back in the 70s and 80s were part of groups like this, working to fight for the environment. And they said, we thought green hydrogen fuel was going to be a solution that protected workers' health, especially in machines that were being operated in factories, in indoor spaces where there was emissions factors that were hurting people. So they were doing it from a completely beneficial point of view. But that factory became part of the stamp site. So they started building this green hydrogen facility in an environmental justice area without any concern for the environment. And so, I mean, I don't know if that gets at the bank that takes an ecosystem approach to banking. Maybe one of the areas that I can say we have some familiarity with is around ecological economics and around the idea of ecosystem services and the provisioning that ecological economics are trying to evaluate and make part of decision making, right? Yeah, I mean, I guess, so the question is, could we have John Henry races between TEK and AI? I know that Indigenous folks are trying to grapple with the AI questions that they're facing. I think the biggest difference I see is the amount of time that we need as part of traditional knowledge. And so that is a currency that is not evaluated in these situations. And I think, you know, one of the things I learned in college that I hear from our elders who went to Geneva, Switzerland, is about the destructive role and beneficial role that technology plays. And there's an equation that we learned in college called the IPAT equation. The impact equals population times affluence times technology. And that goes back to something called Jevons paradox, right? That we saw in steam engines in England who were consuming more coal as they became more efficient, right? And so this is where you have this paradox of where technology can actually impact the world greater in a negative way. And so this is kind of the same message that those chiefs took to Geneva back in 1974. So the answer is not technology, the answer is worldview. And until we get to that point, I don't know if the race is very fair. Yeah. What is the status of the cleanup of Onondaga Lake?
Well, the Superfund remediation part is winding down. It's largely over, but there's still work going on in terms of monitoring, and you know, because of the extent of the contamination, they have to monitor the you know, the discharge, the sediments on the bottom for like the next 25 years or something. And so they're pretty much at that point, I believe. But a lot of it has kind of wrapped up, a lot of the work, yeah. For better or worse, you know, there's still quite a bit of mercury on the bottom of that lake. I was telling someone earlier that they took out about 15% and put it in a landfill, you know, like a lined landfill, and of the mercury-laced sediments, and the rest is still on the bottom of the lake. They just covered it with sand and other materials. And that cap has already failed at least once. So I'm not eating any fish out of that lake anytime soon. I don't know, do you want to add anything, Neil?
No, that's right on. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Have there been endangered species found in the stamp area? I mentioned the short-eared owl, which is endangered in New York, northern harrier, which is listed as threatened in the state. As far as federally listed, they just found a bald eagle nest where this data center is supposed to go. And I think the bald eagle is still listed, is that correct? Maybe it was delisted? Well, it's still, I would imagine it's still a species of concern. And there's some talk, I don't know if it's been confirmed or not, about northern long-eared bat habitat, or whether the bat's present or there. It's a little hard to tell, but yeah, I mean, you saw where Stamp is. I mean, it's surrounded by protected land, And there have been, we actually put a bird list together of over 140 species, including things like sandhill cranes and a number of birds that maybe they're not federally listed, but they're listed by the state as species of special concern, if not threatened or endangered. So yeah, that's the kind of work we're trying to do, is compile all that. Yeah, well, I don't know if people in this room know that the New York State wetlands law was changed to include vernal pools. And so we have also been looking at vernal pools, not on stamp. We've asked a number of times to have permission to survey on stamp, and they always say no, of course. But we've been looking at amphibians, at least on the Haudenosaunee Nation. Again, I can't say much about what we found, except nothing endangered yet. So that would be handy.
Yeah, so the question is, are there other educational institutions that are working sympatrically with what we're doing? You know, it's funny, when I was growing up, the biggest work we had to do was with the New York State Department of Education, who some of you might remember in 4th grade, you might have built a little longhouse. And that was the extent of education in this state about Haudenosaunee people. And so we had a great effort throughout the 80s, 1980s and 90s to develop a curriculum to put in public schools to educate the general public about Haudenosaunee people as rights holders, not as stakeholders, as sovereign nations living within a larger nation. And New York rejected the entire curriculum, and they almost have really to date in a lot of ways. But I would also say at the same time, entities like Land Trust have really gotten involved and actually said, you know what we need to do is we got to give it back. That education is great, and people need to know that there was this injustice, but the work needs to be in rematriating that land and giving it back into the hands of the women of Haudenosaunee people. And so this has been really exciting the last 3 to 5 years, where entities like the Nature Conservancy actually raise funds to buy land and return it to the nations themselves. I don't know, there must be others. There is not many in upstate New York, I would say, in general.
It's mostly nature institutions.
Yes, yep.
It's not general colleges or universities.
Not as much. And there's a tension there, right? That in our community where I come from, people talk about decolonizing universities. But is that even possible, right? Can you actually create an institution that's not controlled by your community to do this work? But we have seen great strides at Syracuse University, our neighbor, who has a promise and pays for full tuition, room and board for any Haudenosaunee student. And that's it's almost 20 years old now. And there are a few SUNY universities who are picking up this charge around American Indian studies or indigenous studies too. But that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, so the question is, what are some other approaches to climate change in addition to or other than ecological? Kyle Whyte from Michigan, he's an Anishinaabeg author, writes about this really well in the idea that we're not a big fan of the term Anthropocene because we've already been through such drastic change with the Colombian invasion that came here as part of that colonial experiment, and the massive amount of loss of life through disease and war. Over hundreds of years of war Haudenosaunee people have been in, finally ended in around 1812 on our homelands. And so the approach has always been about 3 things for Haudenosaunee people in terms of how we adapt or mitigate or respond to these cataclysmic crises. And that is, we actively think about the good mind, so katigarakwas, the idea of replacing negative thoughts with positive ones, that result in a peace between people and between nations. And that peace, when it's combined with good mind thinking, creates a strength. And so in that Gaya Restiu, there are three very specific instructions that talk about this approach to addressing crises that we're in. And so this has been a great opportunity to look at climate change adaptation plans and think about where's the good mind thinking. How is that built into this plan? But that's just off the cuff sort of answer that it goes far beyond the biophysical solutions that are being presented and talked about now. Right. And so the question is there an exchange or crossover between Haudenosaunee people and the surrounding nations and confederacies? And the answer absolutely is yes. And a lot of that takes place at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And so we meet with folks all the time at the UN here in New York, and in particular through the 90s to draft this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I will say before that, there's this guy in this, I just want to forward back to that photo of my uncles in Geneva. There's a guy here, right there in that, right above Oren on the right side. His name was Thomas Binyanka. And the reason that people in our chiefs went to the United Nations is because there was a man from the Hopis that came to us in the late 1940s. And he said, we have a prophecy about what is going to happen to the world. And you're involved in our prophecy. And they began to meet for like 5 or 7 years. And they decided this prophecy was so important, they had to go to the United Nations. And so it's not just, let's say, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Cree people around us in the Great Lakes or out to Massachusetts and the Wabanaki Confederacy. It's international. It goes to agreements we have with the Lakota, agreements we have with even people in South America now, where we've been traveling to understand our corn relationships around corn itself and protecting corn as a cultural expression, in fact. So there's a lot of, and you think about it, in my grandpa's time, that was so rare because nobody traveled like we do now, and now that people are traveling so easy, these collaborations are fruiting much more rapidly, for sure.
In the Oklahoma situation.
We got people in Oklahoma, Cayuga Senecas. Yep, absolutely. Well, I think we're run past our time probably here. Appreciate you listening, and have a good night. Good work for you all.
I brought a few handouts.